Good morning, everyone. Dr. Jyoti has given a very good input into the immunology part of the disease. When this disease started and came into our lives, say around 1.5 years back, we all were taken kind of unawares. We were not knowing this is a new disease, what to expect, what is our role. Same was with the diagnostic laboratories. We were not aware what kind of role are we going to play. Obviously, there is diagnosis, then there is prognosis, there is surveillance, how to go about it. It was a learning curve for all of us. So I'm restricting my talk to the role of the clinical laboratory testing and biosafety. So as I said, the role of the diagnostic laboratory is three-pronged in any disease, not just the COVID, but any disease. First is obviously the diagnosis. You have to diagnose the disease. Then comes the prognosis, where where you want to know how the disease is going to progress, how to help the clinicians to manage the patient, and followed by the serosurveillance. So in the diagnosis, we know it is the molecular testing. I'm touching very briefly upon it because many of you might be knowing already a lot of things about it. So this is basically, it detects the genetic material of the virus by routine sequencing of viral RNA by nucleic acid amplification test, and can detect if a person is currently infected with the COVID-19 virus. The viral genes genomes targeted so far include the ORF1ab, NES, RDRP. So most of the kits are based on these. The sensitivity and specificity of the real-time RT-PCR, however, is not 100%, and the false negative results can be explained by the laboratory practice standards. The personnel who are doing these tests, their skill in the relevant technical and safety procedures, the viral load kinetics in different anatomic sites of the patients, that is from where exactly the sample has been collected and how it has been collected, the sampling procedures, and the standard of the kits used. So there is something like a rapid antigen test also, which we are using for mass screenings. It detects the viral protein, also known as antigens. It's obviously cheaper than RT-PCR and offers results very quickly. However, it is less accurate. Once you have diagnosed the disease, comes the prognosis. Now, prognosis for clinical management is predicting the likely or expected development of a disease, and the diagnostic laboratories play a huge role in it. After the diagnosis, in the prognosis, diagnostic laboratories play a huge role in this. Now, how do you think about the prognosis? How do you predict how the disease is going to develop? What we do is we use there are a plethora of laboratory tests, but which test is specific for a disease where it is going to help you? In case of COVID, earlier not much was known. However, as the disease progressed and a lot of postmortems were conducted to see what organs were affected and the pathophysiology of it, we kind of zeroed in upon quite a few tests in the laboratory which we knew were going to help us in the prognosis. So that is the reason I'm including few slides of pathophysiology for you to understand why those tests are chosen. And probably I know from Dr. Jyoti that a lot of students are there. I wanted to initiate that thought process in the students. When any disease is there, you are developing any test, or some tests were repurposed also in this disease. How it should be done. So in the pathophysiology, we know the SARS-CoV-2 virus enters the host cells, that is the respiratory cells, the respiratory tract, through the angiotensin converting enzyme 2, a receptor on endothelia. And it causes the inflammation, as Dr. Jyoti said, the endothelial cell apoptosis and microvascular thrombosis. So there is another viewpoint which says this is kind of a vascular disease with coagulopathy and thrombosis. The SARS-CoV-2 may infect endothelial cells and cause diffuse endothelitis, subsequent microvascular dysfunction, which leads to hypercoagulability, tissue edema, and organ ischemia. So apart from this, there is also the immune response. The macrophages present SARS-CoV-2 antigen to T cells that activate, differentiate, and release various chemokines, cytokines. All have been discussed by Dr. Jyoti, so I will not go deep into it. There is also the cytokine storm, which recruits the lymphocytes and other leukocytes to the site of infection. And this immune response against the virus results in the pulmonary tissue damage, functional impairment, and reduced lung capacity. However, there will be a subgroup of patients with severe COVID-19 which might have a cytokine storm syndrome with severe systemic inflammation, multiple organ failure, and high inflammatory parameters. So what we can see is COVID-19 is going to affect a lot of systems in the body. I'm just going to discuss very few, the major ones, which will be coagulation. What are the CBC changes? What is the effect on the gastrointestinal tract, the kidneys, the acute phase reactants and inflammatory parameters, and the liver disorders. So in coagulation, there will be coagulopathy, where changes are observed in sepsis-induced, the changes like sepsis-induced coagulopathy or disseminated intravascular coagulopathy are observed. The recent evidence suggests that signs and symptoms of severe COVID-19 resemble the pathophysiology and phenotype of complement-mediated thrombotic macroangiopathy rather than the sepsis-induced coagulopathy or DIC. So what you're going to see is very high levels of D-dimer and fibrinogen of fibrin degradation products, FDP, but also abnormalities of prothrombin time, the acute partial thromboplastin time, and the moderately decreased platelet counts. This is associated with an endotheliopathy that causes TMA and microcirculatory impairment. In the CBC changes, as I said earlier, you're going to see thrombocytopenia. So the platelet count will be somewhere less than 1 lakh or so. There will be altered neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. That is, the neutrophils will be more and lymphocyte less. So there will be lymphopenia. Patients suffering from lymphopenia have exhibited significant decrease in the T cell counts. The serum level of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6 have been closely correlated with lymphopenia and associated with the disease severity. So here again comes the prognosis part. The acute phase reactants and the inflammatory markers will be decreased. And here I want to draw your attention to ferritin, which is generally used in iron deficiency anemias in the diagnosis to see the iron stores in the body. However, ferritin is also acute phase reactant and has been helping a lot in this disease. The CRP levels will be increased, the IL-6 will be increased, as well as the LDH levels. The gastrointestinal disorders, mostly the common presenting symptoms will be loss of appetite, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. And that is, the involvement is because the ACE2 is not only highly expressed in the lung cells, but also in the esophagus, in upper and stratified epithelial cells, and absorptive enterocytes from the ileum and colon. So these GI symptoms in COVID-19 are somehow caused by the direct attack of the SARS-CoV-2, just like it is in the lungs to gastrointestinal tract. The acute kidney injury. So majority of acute kidney injury cases in patients with COVID-19 were related to acute tubular injury. So in severe COVID-19, there is an abundance of cytokines, as we know, which leads to a circulatory collapse and has components of ischemia, reperfusion injury, direct inflammatory injury, coagulation, and endothelial cell dysfunction and apoptosis. And if acute kidney injury is there, you will see elevated creatinine levels. So this is the kind of a diagram of where you can explain the acute kidney injury. So you can see because of the hypervolemia, which is due to fever and insensible loss of fluids, there will be prerenal azotemia. The cytokines which are released will cause circulatory collapse and will cause acute tubular injury. There will be rhabdomyolysis, which will cause myoglobin cast and nephropathy, hypercoagulation microangiopathy, which will cause thrombotic microangiopathy, the collapsing glomerulopathy, and medication-induced damage to the kidneys, which will cause oxalate nephropathy and interstitial nephritis. However, the direct role of viral infection and association with other glomerular diseases is less well understood as of now. What happens is in the liver disorders is there will be mild to moderately elevated ALT and AST levels in the early stages of the disease, which will be accompanied by slight increase in bilirubin and impaired albumin level. That is, the albumin levels will reduce. The prevalence of elevated transaminase and bilirubin is at least twice as high in severe patients than in mild to moderate patients. The cause of this is, one is obviously drug-induced liver injury. So you are taking a lot of antipyretics, which are themselves hepatotoxic, plus other antivirals and antibacterial agents, which are again hepatotoxic. This can lead to drug-induced liver injury and elevated levels of the transaminases. And the systemic inflammatory response syndrome, where the inflammatory cytokine storm induces excessive immune response, and which may be the culprit. So on this background, where you know a little bit about the pathophysiology, you can understand the IFCC, which recommended the test which should be used in prognosis and the changes they will show in this disease. So you can see here the complete blood count, where we have already discussed the WBCs will be increased, the neutrophil count increased, lymphopenia decreased, platelet count, the albumin will be decreased, the transaminases will be increased, the inflammatory parameters like LDH, the IL-6, ferritin, CRP are increased. You can see in coagulation the D dimer is increased, prothrombin time is increased, in kidney the creatinine is increased. So these give an indication, this is how these parameters were chosen to use in the prognosis. So when you're diagnosed a disease, you know how the disease is progressing. But in a disease like COVID-19, which has become now, which is a pandemic, you have to see what is the prevalence in the community as well, for which the serosurveillance is used. However, in serosurveillance, what we are using are the antibodies. So as of now, what FDA, US FDA has approved, the antibody assays are against the spike protein. They detect antibodies against the spike protein, against the nucleic acid protein, and against both spike as well as the nucleic acid protein. What is of interest to us is, are these antibodies neutralizing antibodies? Are they going to protect us from the virus and the disease? So this is just brief where the antibodies start appearing. So somewhere around the day 7 after infection, the IgM becomes detectable and remains detectable, say till day 21 approximately. Around day 14 or after 2 weeks of infection, the patient, in patient sample, the IgG starts becoming detectable and will remain in blood and provide long-term immunity. So what are the neutralizing antibodies? So basically the concept of neutralizing antibody, the hypothesis is that these antibodies will change the viral spike protein and prevent entry of the virus via the ACE2 receptor into a targeted cell. So there will be many other antibodies present in the body, but if they are not going to target that spike protein and the receptor binding domain, they are not going to help us in neutralizing the virus. So basically the coronavirus attacks the host cell, we know, through receptor binding domain on the spike protein by initiating the cell fusion. The RBD on the spike protein situated on the S1 unit interacts directly with the host receptors. The appearance of neutralizing antibody is associated with reduced risk of transmission. They can defend against viral infection by blocking the entry of the virus in the host cells. The antibodies, especially IgG3 and IgG1, against these exhibit various functional characteristics that deliver a very efficient response against viruses. This systemic response against viruses by these antibodies results in neutralization of virus in the host. So the US FDA has authorized tests that give an estimate of the receptor binding domain antibodies in patients who are recovered from SARS-CoV-2 infection. As of now, most of them are semi-quantitative tests that, although do not give exact titer of the antibodies present, do give an estimate of the amount of antibodies present in the patients. New quantitative tests are getting validated. We are doing the same in our laboratory as well, validating one kit for quantitative test for IgG. So the serologic testing detects antibodies against the virus, which may indicate if a person had an infection with the virus that causes COVID-19 in the past. That is why it is very helpful in the serosurveillance. Most antibody tests cannot differentiate between neutralizing versus non-neutralizing antibodies. The rapid antibody detection tests that were used earlier, they do not measure the titer of the antibodies. And there are some tests that provide antibody titer but may not distinguish between different kinds of antibodies. So it's important that you're using a neutralized test which measures the neutralizing antibody and gives you at least semi-quantitative levels of the titer. So what does a positive antibody tell us? So it does tell us that the person who has antibodies was infected in the past with the COVID-19 virus. If the IgM and IgG both are positive, then the infection was recent, maybe within the past few weeks. If only IgG is present, the infection occurred more than a few weeks ago, or the person has been vaccinated. So what vaccines do is they safely deliver an immunogen to the immune system to train it to recognize the pathogen when it is encountered naturally. So what is a positive antibody test does not tell us. It does not tell us whether patient has recovered. A persistent infection may be ongoing. What are the type of antibodies, whether the antibodies are neutralizing or not, unless until a specific assay is used, and what is the titer of the antibody level, unless until you use specific assays such as ELISA. So what does a negative antibody test mean? The person has not been infected. The person was very recently infected within the last 14 days, so not yet detectable, antibodies are not yet detectable. The person was infected and mounted an antibody response, but the antibody levels are below the level of detection of the test. The person was infected but cleared the virus without mounting an antibody response. As of now, I don't think it has been demonstrated for COVID-19. So most COVID-19 patients who recovered have antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 virus detectable in their blood. Most COVID-19 patients develop antibodies about 1 to 3 weeks after symptoms start. This is around the time when many patients start to recover. The patients who have had more severe disease appear to have higher levels of important neutralizing antibodies. And patients who had mild or asymptomatic have low levels of neutralizing antibodies. However, this is debatable. In these persons, it is possible the innate immune response and the T cell response cleared the virus. And the recent studies have shown that neutralizing antibodies may disappear after 3 months. So in our centers, we have been measuring antibodies for our staff who were COVID positive, as well as our cancer patients who were COVID positive and have recovered. And what we have observed is in the staff, around 60% of the staff developed antibodies. And amongst the patients, around 55% cancer patients who were COVID positive developed antibodies. So you can see there is not much difference between the two populations. And we have also seen, at least in few of our staff, that the COVID and neutralizing antibodies around after 3 months or so, they do disappear. So the unanswered questions. Does presence of antibodies mean we are immune to future infection from COVID-19? We do not have enough data as yet to confirm if antibodies protect. And if they protect, what levels of antibodies are required for that protection? And how long that protection will last? So as of now, these are unanswered questions. So do we have herd immunity here? Because serosurveillance is also to see if herd immunity is there or not. So herd immunity is basically the indirect protection of individuals from an infectious disease when a high proportion of population is immune, usually through vaccination, so that the persons who haven't been infected or who haven't had a good immune response are protected because there are enough immune people around them to slow or stop person-to-person transmission. Like if I am vaccinated, if I do get infected by the virus, I'll neutralize it and will not pass it on to others. As of now, the answer is no, we do not have the herd immunity, and most people remain susceptible to COVID-19 infection. So the antibody test assay is available in our laboratory. So we are using the Dimension EXL system by the Siemens Healthineers, which is a total assay, measures both IgG and IgM. We also have the Atelica M SARS-CoV-2 IgG assay and the total, that is IgG plus IgM assay. What these assays do is they detect the nuclear antibodies against the receptor binding domain. The sample types that we are using is serum and EDT or heparinized plasma. So the Dimension EXL CV22 system, it is the sandwich chemiluminescent immunoassay based on the luminescent oxygen channeling immunoassay, that is the LOCET technology. For this assay, the anti-FIDC antibody coated K-bits pre-decorated with fluorescinated S1-RBD antigen are used. The results are interpreted as positive or negative. The cutoff value is 1000 qual units. It is used to distinguish between positive and negative results, and the assay has a range of 0 to 2000 qual units. It is interpreted as less than 1000 qual units as negative and more than or equal to 1000 qual units as positive. The Atelica SARS-CoV-2 assay is a chemiluminescent assay intended for qualitative and semi-quantitative detection of IgG and total antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. The solid phase contains a preformed complex of streptavidin-coated microparticles and biotinylated SARS-CoV-2 recombinant S1-RBD antigens in this assay. Analytical cutoff is 1 index. It is interpreted as less than 1 index as non-reactive and more than or equal to 1 index as reactive. Results are also reported in index units. So these are the two assays that we are using in our laboratory. So no talk on laboratory can be complete without laboratory biosafety. And it is a very important, especially when you're using the infectious microorganisms. And it is not only for the diagnostic laboratories, but also for the research laboratories, where you're going to use the infectious microorganisms or hazardous substances. So basically, biosafety is a discipline which addresses the safe handling and containment of infectious microorganisms and hazardous biological materials. The most important tool in this endeavor is risk assessment. It is conducted for all steps of laboratory processes, that is the pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical. Pre-analytical is when you collect the sample till you receive the sample and before starting the analysis, that is you're preparing the sample for analysis. Analytical is when you're analyzing the sample, and post-analytical is after the analysis of that particular sample is done. All the processes are assessed for hazards such as spillage, aerosol formation, etc., and graded accordingly, ranging from very low to very high depending on the severity of the risk involved. The risk assessment is done to identify and mitigate the risk in the laboratory, and the persons who are doing that risk are the best people to assess that process. So the risk is any chance, high or low, that someone could be harmed by other hazards, together with an indication of how serious the harm could be. The risk assessment is action or series of actions that are taken to recognize or identify hazards and to measure the risk of probability that something will happen because of that hazard. So when you have identified the risk, you have assessed the risk and quantified the hazard, then what you need to do is mitigate the risk. So you need to take the measures to reduce the risk of that hazard. So broadly, following categories need to be considered for risk assessment. One is biological, that is to identify hazards for a specific infectious agent. Then the job safety, that is to identify hazards for a specific task or activity. And procedural, which will combine both biological as well as the job safety. So why it is so important? In terms of COVID, if we want to say, around 1,62,000 cases of COVID that were diagnosed, around 17,300, that is approximately 11%, were the healthcare workers. So it is very important that the biosafety measures are taken not only in the hospitals and the clinical labs as well as research labs, so that the people who are handling those samples are safe from it. So in the pre-analytical, what you need to do is you have to use the appropriate personal protective equipment. Proper packaging of sample after collection should be done. That is the triple packaging, especially in case of COVID. The safe sample transport has to be ensured so that there is no leakage of the sample, and the initial processing of samples in a biosafety cabinet class 2 should be done. For analytical steps, you have to practice good laboratory practices. Rather, it has to be practiced everywhere. The potential infectious material processing has to be done in the biosafety cabinet, especially any aerosol processing procedures. Appropriate PPE should be used for specimen processing. And as far as possible, you should use automated instruments and analyzers. For post-analytical, decontamination of equipment and work surfaces with appropriate disinfectant should be done once the process is over. And proper biomedical waste disposal, that is of PPs, sharps, and other laboratory waste, as per state and national guidelines, has to be done. So what we mean by good laboratory practices, some components are, there is total prohibition of eating food, drinking, smoking, applying cosmetics in the working areas of the laboratory by the staff. Only adequately trained staff should be posted for handling and processing of samples. Appropriate PPE such as gloves, mask, gown, goggles, facial, etc. should be worn as and when required by the staff. So this was one of the first questions that we faced when, in our laboratory especially, that when a sample is received, am I going to get infected with the sample if I'm handling the sample? So if you see in various clinical specimens, the positivity rate for COVID-19 is given as below. So the highest it is for the bronchoalveolar lavage, followed by the sputum, nasal swab, and the lowest is for the blood and urine samples. So when you know this, you know how much precaution you need to take for various samples that you're going to process or handle. Biomedical waste disposal, this is the most important part, because it is not just for our safety, it is also for safety of the community. All contaminated sharp should be disposed in containers that are puncture proof, fitted with lids, and treated as infectious waste. It is the responsibility of the laboratory administration or in charges to provide adequate biohazard containers in the immediate working areas. All biomedical waste should be disposed as per state and national guidelines. The samples that are preserved for post-analysis as per laboratory criteria are also to be disposed later using national and state biomedical waste guidelines. Strict hand hygiene routine has to be practiced after handling infectious material, before exiting the laboratory working area, before having food by all staff working in the laboratory, and all the PPE used should be removed and disposed as infectious waste before leaving the laboratory. So all PP and other laboratory waste is to be collected in yellow bags as per the State Pollution Control Board norms, and autoclaved at 121 degrees Celsius and 15 PCA for 60 minutes using chemical and or biological indicators, so that you know whether your process is actually the process of disinfection has taken place or not. It is then labeled as COVID-19 waste before handing over to certified biomedical waste treatment facility in double-layered yellow bags. All waste handlers must wear adequate personal protective equipment. So it is not just the laboratory, the staff, the students, also the housekeeping people who are going to handle these waste. They should also wear adequate personal protective equipment. The laboratory should follow any additional state or national guidelines on biomedical waste disposal. So after the waste is disposed, in the post-analytical phase, it is the decontamination of the surfaces and the equipment. So the recommended use of disinfectants is 1% sodium hypochlorite, 62 to 71% ethanol for surface disinfection, or hydrogen peroxide, that is 0.5% hydrogen peroxide. Sodium hypochlorite is not to be used on the metal surfaces, so better to use 62 to 70%, 71% ethanol for the same. All surfaces should be disinfected frequently. It is important to ensure appropriate contact time as well as dilutions and expiry date for prepared disinfectants as advised by the manufacturer. So it's important you follow the guidelines of the manufacturers and read the instructions carefully. Incident reporting, this is always the neglected part. Something happens in the laboratory and the incident is generally not reported, either out of fear or negligence. So it's very important that all staff should be trained to report and handle adverse incidents such as exposure to infectious materials, spills, etc. And the laboratory should have process of for reporting of adverse incidents. Spill management kits should be available in all areas of the laboratory along with procedure to manage the spills. So depending on the kind of procedures you're doing in your laboratory, you can keep the spill management kits to take care of it. And the first aid kit should always be there available to the staff. It is important to ensure that the above mentioned laboratory biosafety measures be implemented and adhered to so as to minimize the risk of laboratory transmission of COVID-19 to healthcare workers. The challenges that we faced during the pandemic. So immediate challenge last year was the staff apprehension and anxiety. Obviously, everybody was scared to travel. Everybody was scared to handle the sample. What is going to happen to me? What is going to happen to my family? When I go home, what happens? So to take care of that, obviously we took care of the staff safety. So all the personal protective equipments were provided to staff wherever required. Staff training was taken not only in handling all these infectious samples as well as the biomedical waste disposal. Any additional precautions need to be taken. What all staff should be doing in their personal life as well as while traveling, etc., while interacting with other people, and the motivation. Staff had to be motivated to work. Obviously, the lockdown phase, we faced the biggest challenge was the transport and the logistic. Because of the lockdown, the services were down and no transport was available for the staff. So we had to make do with whatever little staff we had who could come with their own vehicle and had to have staggered duties due to lack of manpower. Obviously, the services were also scaled down in the hospital. The reagent supply was hampered big time. So we had to prioritize and arrange for the reagents. Other than our regular suppliers, we had to depend on, find and depend other suppliers as well. So these were the challenges that we faced during the pandemic last year. Although the pandemic still there, these some of the challenges are not there so much now. And I want to thank Dr. Vivek Bhatt, Poonam Gira, Dr. Avinash, and Dr. Kshama Pansare for all the inputs they have provided to me. And these are some of the references for the material that I have used. And myself and Dr. Vivek, we have had some publication also on the laboratory biosafety as well as the return to work for the staff after becoming COVID positive, and the levels of the virus culture and antibody. You can Google them. Thank you. I have finished well in time, I guess.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Ma'am, we have a few questions that I will just read out. So the first question is, ma'am, do you check the level of antibodies for the individual who donated plasma after recovering from COVID?
See, because we are institution-based laboratory, so what happens is, our blood bank is not collecting plasma for the COVID positive plasma for treatment purpose. So we are not testing it for it. We can do it if required, and if the institute allows it, we are equipped to measure it. But as of now, we are not doing it. We are doing it only for the patient samples. And we are also having one project where we are measuring the antibody levels in post-vaccinated people. So that is a project which is going on with Dr. Vikram Gota. That is a clinical pharmacology lab in collaboration with them. So we are doing that.
Okay, ma'am. Second question is, how could you explain that an RT-PCR positive report still shows a negative for the antibody test after 21 days and without quarantine?
Also, what you mean to say, a person who was RT-PCR positive and did not develop antibodies?
Antibodies, even after 21 days, the antibody report shows negative, even though they've been in quarantine.
I think now you have missed that slide which I had for this. I'll just put the slide again for you. Why it will happen? What does a negative test mean? Let me share this slide again. See, basically what a negative slide will mean to you is the person has not been infected. In this case, person was infected. So after 21 days, if it is not yet cannot be measured, then it means the person was infected and mounted an antibody response, but the antibody levels are probably below the level of detection of that test. So probably you did develop antibody response, but this was after RT-PCR, right? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. After the positive RT-PCR, yes.
So probably the antibody response was mounted. However, the antibody levels are below the level of detection. And if you see, even in our center, only 55% of the patients, cancer patients, developed antibodies post-infection, and only 60% of staff developed antibodies post-infection. So that doesn't mean that antibody response was not mounted. Probably it was mounted, but the level of detection, the antibody levels are too low for detection.
Yes, thank you, ma'am, for that. The next question, ma'am, is do you carry out SARS-CoV-2 inhibitor screening?
SARS-CoV-2?
Inhibitor screening.
Inhibitor screening, I did not get that.
So, ma'am, this is a question that was posted by Maushami.
I want to know, madam, that do you carry out inhibitor screening? There is some antiviral assay.
Oh, no,
certain drugs.
No, we don't.
Okay. Any other lab doing so?
Pardon?
Any other lab at any other lab?
No, I'm not aware.
Yeah.
Okay.
NIV Pune, they do the testing.
Yeah, they are not replying because there is a lot of work burden right now.
Yeah, right. They are very busy.
Yeah.
Ma'am,
Thank you
and
so much.
yeah, just one final question. So the antibody detection method in the lab, does it detect only the neutralizing antibodies, or is it specific for a certain antibody?
It is
the
specific
detection method that is
specific for, what is the next part?
So, ma'am, is the antibody detection method only detecting neutralizing antibodies, or like is it for the whole antibody titer?
No.
Question.
What it detects is the antibodies against the receptor binding domain on the S1 spike protein. So it only detects those neutralizing antibodies. It does not detect other antibodies. Because if you see, I just showed in my slide that what we do is in our assays now, what they're using is the specific anti-FITC antibody coated chemibids for S1 RBD antigen are used in both the assays. So we are measuring only antibodies to receptor binding domain. Those are the neutralizing antibody, nothing else.
Okay, ma'am. Yeah. And ma'am, the other question is that they would like to know what the meaning of the CT value is for RT-PCR. So what exactly do CT values stand in?
I'm very sorry because the RT-PCR part is not done in our lab. It is done in the hematopathology lab. I just included those 2 slides for RT-PCR. And what CT means, I think you better, Dr. Jyoti, later on Dr. Prashant Tembare is there. You can direct that question to him. He will be the best person to answer that.
Okay, we have a few more questions, and I think if we have time, then should we go ahead with them?
Maybe one important, Nathan, just one more important, and later on we should move to next speaker.
Okay, see, I see one question here that I want to take is, has any study been done for determining how long the protection will last after vaccination? Since there are reports. Okay, so I want to answer this. I told you, as I told you, we are already conducting one study with clinical pharmacology lab where we are collecting samples and we are trying to see for how long the antibodies are going to last. So we are conducting that study, but there will be some time for the results to come out. However, in patients, I can say, like, those who were infected with COVID-19 and recovered, in our staff, what we have observed, I have not yet analyzed the data fully, or we have not done for all the staff. So what we have seen, those staff who had the antibodies, somewhere around 2.5 to 3 months, the antibodies did disappear. In few of the staffs, for various reasons where we wanted to check the antibody level, the antibodies were not there beyond around 3 months. This is in the COVID positive patients. The vaccination, the trial is still going.